Thank you, Sumina. I see your thumbs up. So hi everybody, and good evening from my side. It's lovely to have you all here, all of our participants from your own corner of the world. Welcome to Restore Her Rights Initiative webinar number 6. So today we'll be talking about integrating gender equality in ecosystem restoration, the intersection of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So how do these conventions, address gender equality, and how do they implement gender policies in their own work? That's what we want to know. Apart from that, let me just begin again by saying welcome and taking the time out of all of your busy schedule to be part of this conversation. So, like I said, right, it dives into two very important environmental conventions, the UNCBD and the UNCCD. They both have contributed significantly in raising awareness about and reversing degradation of ecosystems, be it land, be it water, be it diverse ecosystems around the world, right? And they have been very key to building conservation and restoration, conversations around conservation and restoration globally. So, like I said, we will shift our focus towards their gender policy and how they implement it within their frameworks. To further explain this, we have wonderful experts. We have 4 panelists, and I'll be introducing them further. Before we move further, let's go over some ground rules. Please kindly keep your microphones off. This is to respect our speakers who are here and to listen to the insights. The second is our vote. Sorry. Was that anybody? Our mode of delivery is English, but we also have live interpretation, and they are in Spanish and in French. Please use the interpretation globe below. You see, there's a banner there below at the bottom of your screen, and you can use it to change to whichever language you prefer. This session is also being live streamed on YouTube and will be available to people who are unable to attend today's session. So please feel free to also use this for further dissemination. Likewise, please feel free to share this among your peers and your network, especially for those who wanted to join, but unfortunately couldn't. Also, for our question and answer session, please use the question and answer box. Again, if you look at the banner below in your screen, there's a separate box for question and answers so that you can place your questions there when the panelists are actually presenting. So you don't have to wait to the end. We will, however, address these questions once the panelists are done with their sessions. Finally, we would also love to hear where you all are from, what you do. So please use the chat box, again, down below, to introduce yourselves and also, just to catch up on your peers. Now, like I said, before we dive into our speakers, I'd like to introduce a little bit about the Restore Her Rights Initiative itself. The Restore Her Rights Initiative started with the idea that we wanted to amplify women's voices, and especially women who belong to marginalized communities, to local and indigenous communities. So we wanted to amplify what's happening on the ground, right? And to do this, it was designed with 4 objectives in mind. So one is to promote rights, because a lot of the times policies, and it's very systemic, right? So a lot of the times policies and programs and initiatives, a lot of the times women and their work is invisible. So we want that to be intentional. So that's the reason why we want to promote their rights and their access to rights and restoration initiatives, to be able to celebrate by highlighting and amplifying their work, and how they've driven social, cultural, and economic progress in the community. And of course, to be able to amplify that at the regional and international level. To be able to collaborate through dialogue, through knowledge exchange, not just between communities, but by engaging them with scholars, with researchers and organizations around the world. And finally, by providing them tools and resources and capacity building initiatives so that we can continue empowering women across the globe. Our core components include these four things. So the first thing is advocacy. So Women for Biodiversity is known for its advocacy to be through our campaigns and through our partnerships, we raise our voices to make sure that women are included in policy spaces and policy spheres. Also, we do this and we amplify their work through storytelling, through digital and visual storytelling, so that we can inspire other people to come forward with their own work. We also want to have like a community exchange platform where we can discuss this work, have cross-cultural knowledge exchange, and also to basically work in solidarity with each other, and to build a learning resource center. So where we have, where we have available capacity building workshops, webinars, training programs, right? Studies and toolkits where people can come together and research on these things. So those are our four components that sort of bind and build Women for Restore Her Rights initiative. So our core speakers, like I said, are, our first speaker is Ms. Karen Elizabeth Bernard. She is a gender policy officer at UNCCD. And she's a gender and international development professional with 20 years of experience across the Caribbean, Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. She supports and implements the Gender Action Plan, focusing on land rights, climate resilience, and women's leadership. So before we go to our further speakers, I would like to give the floor actually to Ms. Bernard so that we can do this one after the other. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Rubina and Mrinalini for inviting me to participate. I'm pleased to speak with all of you today and share some of our perspectives from the UNCCD. So based on the questions that were provided, I prepared a presentation to share with you. And I understand that the questions would be after all of the presenters, but I do look forward to hearing your feedback and any questions that you have. So let's go to the next slide. I just want to check if you can hear me well. The volume is fine?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Right, so the framework that we have at UNCCD for shaping our contributions and our interventions and our understanding of how to integrate gender properly and women's empowerment into the work that we're doing on land restoration is our Gender Action Plan. This was approved by the parties, the member countries to the convention in 2017. The Gender Action Plan, now our work focuses on degradation, land degradation, desertification, and drought. And so this is clearly linked to restoration as one of the main ways of addressing these phenomena that we're concerned about. So land restoration is a large part of the solution that we'll find in the program of work that we have at UNCCD. And the Gender Action Plan focuses on 4 priorities for action. One is women's equal participation in decisions made during the design, planning, implementation, and evaluation of initiatives to be implemented under the convention. Secondly, enhancing women's access to improved knowledge and technologies, which would be needed for land restoration. Integrating women's economic empowerment into UNCCD implementation activities in order to eradicate extreme poverty and strengthening women's land rights and access to resources. So if we go now, what I wanted to share with you also is that, as you saw, these 4 priority areas are very general. So there was a request from our parties, member countries, to develop more specific roadmap, which would show what actually are the activities that we should all be undertaking in relation to these 4 strategic priorities, so that it's easier to operationalize this in the country level and also regionally and internationally. So in 2022, we adopted a gender roadmap for this purpose to guide and accelerate the implementation of our Gender Action Plan, which involves gender mainstreaming and also gender-specific activities. which in many ways are related to land restoration led by women. So here you have an overview of the roadmap, which also indicates which are the entities leading and supporting on each of these actions. And in the next slides, I just want to show you closer up what the details of this roadmap looks like, because this is, well, not readable. So please, let's see the next slide. Okay, so this is an example from 2023 to 2024 of the roadmap. The roadmap is aligned to our strategic framework, which goes until 2030. And the Gender Action Plan also is working with that time frame. So here we see different activities that we should be doing year by year, some of which are to be led by the Secretariat from my office, and others which could be led by Global Mechanism, which is our resource mobilization arm, or led by perhaps the CSOs, other entities, and so on. So just to give you some, I want to mention some of these here. So we have dissemination of adaptation practices, which are used by and benefiting women to increase their resilience to drought. So I'm going to share an example of that. The second half of the presentation focuses on a lot of these adaptation practices, which as you would be able to understand that these generally are ways of implementing land restoration in specific locations. And then we have, for example, space for data and knowledge. This relates to one of the challenges that we're facing, evidence and policy relevant research. So the dissemination of adaptation practices is one of the examples of evidence, qualitative, I guess, or specific case studies showing how women are playing a leadership role and using a lot of ingenuity in their practices to address drought and to also restore the land. And then we have the Gender Caucus, which is a multi-stakeholder platform, bringing together experts in gender, bringing together organizations, individuals, CSOs, academic, also the countries, particularly committed to mainstreaming gender across everything that the convention is doing. So these are just some examples. But I would already start to share with you that the challenges that we're finding are that, for example, with the data and knowledge issues, the knowledge is, of course, there's quite a large amount of knowledge. You yourselves would be people who bring a lot of knowledge on how to mainstream gender into the work of the convention. The data is often lacking, so this is a challenge. And by that we mean sex disaggregated data showing that how women and men are impacted differently by drought, land degradation, how women and men are engaging differently in land restoration. So a lot of this information needs to be still compiled. And I think part of the solution, or the solution generally needs to come from the local and national levels, because there are data collection systems in place. And however, the data collected is often not sex disaggregated. So we have national statistics system, we have household income and expenditure surveys. We have, in some countries, you might have satellite accounts, which are tracking the amount of time women spend in unpaid labor, household labor. So often this data is unfortunately incomplete or not gathered. So that is one of our big challenges that we need to address. So if we can just go to the next slide. And then here we have a few of the examples I'll mention to you. One in which we have a lot of success this year, or finally a breakthrough, is to provide earmarked travel funds to support women participating alongside men in equal numbers in national delegations that go to the UNCCD sessions. So we now finally have a Women Delegates Fund with earmarked travel funds. And then we also have leadership and negotiation training for women associated with that, so that they can gain negotiation skills. I should mention that this has been possible because of resources that were provided by donors that are specifically highly committed to mainstreaming gender across all of our work. And those are the GIZ from Germany and then also European Union. So we're very excited to have this finally happening. And of course, the impact of having women more involved in all of our processes, particularly as part of delegations. So the delegations are where the decisions are negotiated and finally reached, which then provides instructions to me, for example, and other colleagues here at the Secretariat of what we need to do. So that's obviously implementing our gender action plan. And this also, in a very general sense, this is a way in which the perspectives of women, the experience of women are brought into those discussions and into those deliberations, which enriches all of the work that is being done at different countries and different regions so that we can be more effective in land restoration. Now, you may know that we have targets for land degradation neutrality. And to express that in the most simple of terms, land degradation neutrality is it's an equation which involves preventing land degradation or not furthering land degradation on one hand, and then on the other hand, land restoration. So that's how we reach land degradation neutrality. And we need all of the diversity of different people, different perspectives, different experiences to reach the best decisions on how we're going to take that forward. But I will also say that we do need more tools and guidelines for gender mainstreaming that will assist us also in implementation of the Gender Action Plan. And as we look at this roadmap, I would also say that one of the shortcomings that we have, or one of the gaps that we have, is to obtain the resources that would be required to achieve some of the items on this roadmap. We can go to the next slide. So this is essentially more of the same. And we can still add different activities here towards the end of this roadmap. But I think those are the main, this is also a way of considering some of the main gaps that we have in mainstreaming gender in our work, and then also specific activities under the convention, which would specifically support women, empower women, as we saw in the Gender Action Plan. So we need resources and we need the data, and we're constantly working on these issues. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so here we have mobilizing resources, increasing women's participation. Engaging women's groups obviously is a key activity. That's something that would, to a great extent, we hope that that would be happening at the country level, at grassroots level. Okay, I'm seeing a message here that people are not seeing the PowerPoint. So maybe we should stop for a moment and just see if we can check if that's the case for everyone.
Just give me a minute. Hold on. Let me share that again. Share. Can people see my PowerPoint? Please give me a thumbs up if you can. Yeah? All right, perfect.
So maybe that's an issue with one person's computer or a few people's computer screen.
Thank you so much, Karen,
Sorry.
for letting me know. I was so focused on listening to you. Hold on. Yeah, please continue. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so should we, okay. So I think that might require an individual solution for that technology issue. Should we move on to the next slides?
Yeah, no worries at all.
Okay, so now I wanted to dive in a bit more into one of the activities that you saw on our roadmap to implement the Gender Action Plan. And I think this is quite key, and I'm very pleased to say that we've had the support of Lorena Aguilar, who I'm sure many of you would know. She's an international expert on gender and environment issues, and worked for many years as a senior advisor for IUCN on gender. So, and so this activity refers to evidence and policy relevant research. Women-led solutions for drought resilience is one of the reports. We have actually two reports that we've issued in the last couple of years. One of them is on the differentiated impacts of desertification, land degradation, and drought. I'm moving on. And so that's more of the impacts, and in a way provides the rationale for the need to invest in and mobilize people and mobilize women in particular to engage in land restoration. And also it helps us address the gap of lack of data. There was a lot of data gathered for that report, which is available on our website in the summary for decision makers, but then also the full report is there. So there's quite a bit of data that was diligently gathered by Lorena. And then I think now the more recent report that we've developed as well, again, the research led by Lorena, is Women-Led Solutions for Drought Resilience. And I wanted to share more with you because there are a number of examples in which essentially it's land restoration activities that women are engaged in as part of what we framed it as drought resilience. And I think you know that among the three Rio conventions, the Convention on Biodiversity, UNFCCC, and our Convention on Desertification, we're all working on land issues. And there's a huge amount of convergence on the work that we're doing. And so sometimes it's just a matter of framing it in a different way. But this does get into examples of women specifically contributing to land restoration, because often, as you would know, that women's work is more invisible or doesn't get the recognition that's deserved, not taken into account, and in that way, not influencing as much as it should national policies and when resources come in where they're assigned and so on. So I wanted to really highlight that and get beyond the observation also that women and girls are most impacted by land degradation, but then also to highlight their ingenuity, resourcefulness, the contributions and the solutions that women are bringing, and essentially their leadership and agency. So that's what we've done in this report. And it was exciting to see that we had more than 87 submissions from countries all over the world. So we had many, many submissions, and that's just shows you a little bit of how widespread it is that women are playing these kind of roles in finding solutions and engaging in land restoration. And also of those 87 submissions, we analyzed all of them and selected 35 case studies, which are in the report. Again, this is on our website, and that was launched last year on the International Day for Rural Women. And then it was also presented at our Conference of Parties, COP16, and we were very fortunate to have 6 of the women champions who are actually leading and implementing these activities in their respective countries, join us for that launching of the report, and also share their experiences and the challenges that they faced, and some of the lessons learned that they had from leading those experiences. So if we go to the next slide, I'll share with you some of these examples. So we had, for example, in Nigeria, a group called Fantasy Radio, which is a weekly radio program, interviews local farmers, experts, supply chain partners, and it disseminates information through a medium which is considered accessible for women in rural locations on climate smart practices, water conservation, innovative irrigation technologies, drought monitoring services, and has reached hundreds of thousands of women who work as small farmers. So this is one of the more innovative and experiences that we found, which has a lot of impact. And so that enables women to have access to information and knowledge, which will enable them to engage in more effective land restoration. And then the photograph that we see on the left is from an experience in Kenya, led by a local organization called Impact, in which pastoralist women in the northern area of Kenya are undertaking innovative rangeland restoration techniques. And this involves semicircular bunds, and women are digging the bunds, reseeding the bare lands with perennial grass species. And also, when women become involved in these type of activities, as would often happen, then they become more involved in the community decision-making process. And so there's planning and decisions to be made about land use and grazing plans. So that was also a wonderful example on women's role in land restoration. And these are, of course, activities that could be replicated in other countries as well in similar contexts. We can go to the next slide. Okay, these are a couple of other examples. In Iran, we had a very interesting case of a professor, Dr. 𝗺𝗱𝗶, who employs a specific technique. Obviously, she's a scientist, very established in her field, and she's working with something called mycorrhizal fungi. I'm not a scientist myself, so I can't really tell you what that is, but according to her research, this enhances and restores vegetation and improves soil quality in areas which are very intractable to land restoration. In this case, it's a salt flats area of a particular region of Iran, which has become desertified. So the land is in dire need of restoration. And then, so she leads this process, but she trains local women to implement it, as you can see in the picture. So that was a brilliant way in which we can use modern science, and women are using also modern scientific techniques and their advanced technical skills to share those with other women, to replicate those, and to restore the land in their locations. Another example, which is along these same lines, is an organization called Sand to Green in Morocco. So you can see from the title that they're looking at taking sandy areas and then undertaking land restoration so that these become green areas with vegetation that's thriving. And in this case, we also have two young women who are scientists. They're agricultural engineers, and they're running an experimental plantation in southern Morocco, which is developing and testing regenerative farming methods. Again, this is for dry lands, arid lands. And the technique that they're working with involves recycling of brine or salty water as a waste product of desalination to recover the salts and minerals, which are then used to fertilize and to enrich agricultural land, or could be used for industrial use. Let's go to the next slide. So a couple of more examples. One is from India. You may have heard of this because I think it's fairly widely known. A women's organization is addressing intense drought in the Gujarat region through a particular engineering technique in which they have underground reservoirs that capture and store rainwater during the monsoon season. Monsoon, of course, is the season of heavy rains or cyclones. And then they have a structure which is called a bungaroo, which looks like a giant straw. And it prevents water evaporation and contamination, which ensures year-round irrigation supply and also recharges the groundwater aquifers, which helps to replenish the water table and helps to create an environment for land restoration and through this particular water conservation and management technique. So that again is very innovative. And then in Kenya, we have an example from Kajiado County in which Maasai women manage grass seed banks for landscape restoration, which then serve as vital repositories of diverse native grass species and adapt to local climate conditions. Then they sell the grass seeds harvested from these banks, which generates a source of income. So finally, we have something that speaks to the issue of women's economic empowerment, which generates some funds for them that they can use to pay for school fees, healthcare, family support, or in some cases to purchase cattle and sheep. So this is also part of empowerment, that once women have an income source, and then that gives them more ability to make decisions on how they're going to allocate those resources from their income and to make choices in that regard, which is quite of course, important for women's empowerment. And let's go to the next slide. And this is the last example that I want to share with you, which is from Peru. And quite interesting that there's a group of 6 sisters called the 𝗙liche𝗰𝗶𝗹 sisters, and they are trained engineers. And they're building rain ponds in natural depressions as a network which then retains and stores the rainwater, and again enhances the groundwater recharge. So recovering the water table underneath the surface. And there's a number of also details to this, which are in the report, and quite fascinating to look at all of those. But they're conducting these activities in the context of an indigenous practice called water nurturing, or rainwater planting and harvesting. And this is, it's part of a concept of the world that we live in, or the cosmovision of Andean indigenous groups, to think of the earth as something that we need to nurture, that we need to respect, that we need to honor. You know, the idea of like mothering the earth. And it's a whole different concept of your relationship to the earth and your role in that. So what was quite fascinating about this example is that they're combining the fact that these women are engineers that went to university in the city and then came back to their local community. So they're trained technicians. And then they're also incorporating that into the worldview, indigenous worldview, to honor the relationship with the earth. And it's quite effective and quite interesting. And what they've managed to accomplish for their community is to ensure a year-round water supply. So even during dry seasons, there's enough water to support the local agriculture, and there's enough water for the household use. So very effective approach. And I would just now share with you, I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but I think Rubina will let me know if I am. Just some of the findings, general findings from this particular research, which should help inform policies for highlighting women's role and expanding women's role in land restoration. So I think I've alluded to some of these during the presentation so far, but there's often a science-based component in a lot of these experiences that we've looked at here. And this requires women's equal access to scientific training, studies, and certification, which has impact on a number of levels so that they can become more involved in informed decision-making about land management. And it's also so that they can realize their full potential as people who have those specific talents and abilities, in the case of women who are working in these fields. And that also this generates decent jobs. So if you have one of these type of, if you're an engineer or you're a firefighter, as the woman in this photograph in Costa Rica, or you have any of these technical jobs, you have a decent employment, you have a salary which is, you know, at a certain level. And so it really does empower you and provide more security for women who work in these fields. And also looking at non-traditional careers, jobs, and roles allows us to modify our perceptions about the types of work that are typically considered according to stereotypes that women should be engaged in, as opposed to those that men are engaged in. And we see that in every context, that there's, you know, the better jobs, the higher incomes, the jobs which require more travel or more access to resources and engaging in, say, commercial trading as opposed to subsistence are normally dominated by men. So we need to get women into jobs that are not traditionally considered to be more women's jobs. And of course, there are some perceptions and cultural norms which are blocking that from happening. And let's go to the next slide. So another one of the insights from this particular study was that some of the alternatives to traditional soil management for land restoration include managing and conserving water. There's all different ways that women are doing this in different parts of the world, as we saw. Strategic use of drought-resistant seed and crops, that helps to restore the land. innovative new income generation activities, and leveraging of climate information services. So that gets us back to the Gender Action Plan, in which one of the 4 pillars was women's access to knowledge and resources and technology. Then also, women are often custodians of ancestral knowledges of land restoration techniques, which are actually very effective and then should be therefore better known, documented, disseminated, and that women should be recognized for leading these very effective activities and for conserving and holding on to that traditional knowledge. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I think this is the last one. Okay. So we also need to ensure the equal participation of women and men in drought management and land restoration. This is important. And so, of course, women's groups are playing a critical role in advocating for women's equal engagement and participation in these activities. So it's this collective action of working with women's groups, which also enables that to be taken forward. And then I think this is the final observation, that the most gender transformative examples that we find, which transform the gender systems, the gender hierarchies, which tend to overcome women's discrimination against women or women's subordination, involve women taking on non-traditional roles and jobs, acting as multipliers of knowledge. So we saw a lot of women working together, women training other women in the experiences that we looked at in this presentation. And again, working in collectives and associations, which will allow them to also pool resources and then to increase their negotiating power. So I think this is the end of the presentation. If we can just go to the next slide. Okay, so this was the last one. Thank you to all of you, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have. And yeah, and thanks for your attention and for and again for having me in this webinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. I think that was amazing. And just to sort of tie it together is when I first began with introducing you, and it's nice that you also pointed out the women's work a lot of the time is invisible, especially even in restoration, right? And for you to actually address my questions really well, which is one, the first question that I asked was, what kind of gaps do you see, right? What kind of challenges have you faced? And you sort of showed that with your roadmap and the kind of challenges in terms of data collection and having poor data, and actually tying that really well with the real world examples that came out of all of the research work that's been done. And I particularly like to highlight the point that a lot of the times it's interesting when women break barriers and glass ceilings in non-traditional jobs, because a lot of the times even these jobs are very masculine in nature, right? They're always considered men's jobs. So to be able to showcase that through your work has been absolutely inspiring. Thank you very much. Before we go on to the question and answers, I wanted to invite our panelist from CBD, but unfortunately, Olivier's network has been very dodgy today. So he's going to be back. But before we move on to CBD, is it okay if I request Joanne to, continue this conversation? Joanne, is that okay if you can take it away?
Oh, sure. Happy
Okay.
to.
All right, wonderful. So yeah,
Sure.
let me
I'm
just
glad to. Sure.
let me just introduce you really quick so that people know who we are talking about.
Yeah,
So
please.
yeah, so let me just stop sharing this and hold on. So Joanne Lee, she is the head of stakeholder engagement for the G20 Global Land Initiative at the UNCCD. She's a program officer at the UNCCD in Bonn, where she leads stakeholder engagement for the G20 Global Land Initiative. She has over 13 years of experience in program management and law, with prior roles at the UN Women, supporting member states on gender equality, sustainable development, and technology policy. So I had a few questions for Joanne as well, which I'll be putting in the chat box if people would like to sort of see. But yeah, without further ado, Joanne, please take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ravina, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be part of this important series by Women for Biodiversity. So thank you again. I just wanted to give some background information first before I start off on the G20 Global Land Initiative, in case there's anyone here who hasn't heard about us. So as you know, the G20 is an intergovernmental forum of the world's major developed and developing economies. So it comprises of 19 countries and the European Union and the African Union. And in 2020, the G20 leaders launched the G20 Global Land Initiative with the global ambition to reduce 50% of degraded land by the year 2040. And so we work mainly in 4 different areas. I mean, Rubina, I was glad to see the 4 priorities that you had. And so it's great to see like the linkages between our different pillars. So our first is on sharing knowledge and showcasing success stories. The second is on engaging the private sector in sustainable land management and land restoration. The third is empowering civil society and the public with land stewardship. And the last is sharing knowledge and developing the capacity between G20 countries and non-G20 countries. So our initiative is hosted in the UNCCD. And as G20, we also lead the Land Challenge under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And as an organization, we don't have our own implementation projects, but in 2024, the G20 Global Land Initiative launched its Small Grants Program. And so this program is designed to support community-led restoration efforts. And so we received over 700 applications from over 100 countries. So there's obviously very high demand for resources for a lot of these civil society organizations who are doing restoration work. And so ultimately, we selected 39 of these projects, and we provided grants in the amounts between $5,000 and $15,000 US. And so the winners included, several different projects with women-led cooperatives who are reclaiming control over land, as well as several of these projects also centered women in restoration roles and value chains, and helped remove practical barriers to women's participation. And I just want to give a few examples. Karen gave a lot of great examples, so I'll just focus on 3 of them, on how gender was integrated into these projects and some of the possible impacts that it had. And so in one project in Senegal, women were working in regenerative agriculture and aquaculture. And so they co-designed these initiatives to lead community gardens that supplied organic produce. And a lot of these concerns address the burdens that are often carried by women, such as the lack of income, food insecurity, water scarcity. And so the impact of this project was that women's household incomes increased by 25% by creating these market gardens, and more than 1,000 people per community were able to gain access to nutritious food. And the projects also led to improved soil and water management within the community, and helped reduce forced migration, and also helped preserve traditional ecological knowledge. And another project in Costa Rica, it supported women in tree nursery management and helped them gain the capacity to conduct restoration activities on their own and train others to use organic agricultural approaches that incorporated traditional and local knowledge. This program, in their trainings, they provided stipends, childcare, transportation support for Indigenous women to ensure their inclusion. And an impact of this project was that, we saw an increase in women's technical skills and their autonomy. So it expanded their capacity for restoration. And this inclusive design ensured that the benefits were spread around the community. And in the last example from Rwanda, this project centered around sustainable cooperative farming, which was completely women-led, and it was created from conversations from genocide survivors who had asked for land and autonomy. And so these women run their own cooperatives, they decide what to grow, they manage the production, and the project provides legal support, and it provides land and training to women within the communities. And each cooperative is designed to lift 100 families from poverty and to be completely self-sustaining within 5 years. And so they implement a training of trainers model that enables them to pass this knowledge and skills around restoration and sustainable farming to other women in other rural areas. And so as a result of this project, women were able to gain land ownership and transform their situation into one where they became completely self-sustaining. It also led to greater adoption of climate smart farming within the community. So you saw how these women were sharing the knowledge that they had with others. And so we saw that gender integration and inclusive governance leads to better restoration outcomes. When women are included as planners, leaders, beneficiaries, we saw that these projects can achieve higher survival rate of trees, improved land productivity, and as well as stronger community ownership over these projects. And we saw how women's economic empowerment is really driving sustainability. So when women gain income and agency through restoration, they are able to reinvest that into the welfare of their family and their communities. And so we saw how integrating gender perspectives didn't just promote gender equality, but it actually improved restoration outcomes. It expanded the pool of skilled restoration leaders. It increased community ownership, it improved the long-term maintenance of restored areas because of that ownership. And so, we're understanding the benefits of linking women's economic empowerment with ecological stewardship. And when you look at these 3 examples, you saw that gender integration wasn't just an add-on to the project, but it was actually core to the project design and the governance. And so it put these women in control of the decisions, the land access to land, and the generation of income. And so we saw how this led to better outcomes for the community as well. And there's a lot of discussion about women in the care economy, but I think it would be amazing to see more about the women's role in the restoration economy. And so, we are seeing that degradation costs the global economy around $880 billion annually. And we know that nature underpins more than half of the global GDP, which would be around $58 trillion. And when you look at all the restoration commitments around the world, we're seeing that this industry has the potential to generate $1.5 to $2 trillion in economic value. And it's so important that women are part of that and benefiting from that, right? So when you look at the US, this restoration sector is already supporting over 200,000 jobs. And these employment multipliers are on par with other industries, such as the oil and gas industry, the agriculture industry. And we're seeing that this restoration industry could also contribute to $25 billion in economic output annually. There was a recent publication on Brazil as well, how restoring degraded pasture lands could generate over $140 billion and lead to over 350,000 jobs annually. And so we're seeing the internal rates of returns of restoration up to 169%. So it far outperforms, traditional cattle ranching. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing a 23% annual increase in investment in nature-based climate solutions since 2012. And so around the globe, we're seeing that strategic investment in land restoration, it's not only supports like climate and biodiversity goals, but it's really an engine for job creation, rural development, and resilient growth. And last year, the G20 Global Land Initiative, we published a technical paper on the restoration economy, and we identified several enabling conditions to support the growth, including creating policy certainty, mobilizing private capital, professionalizing the sector, and building accountability systems, including tracking the outputs of restoration. And so I was thinking about how can we scale up gender equality and restoration efforts and integrate partnerships into these 4 different areas so that we ensure that women are also part of the restoration economy and benefiting from it. So in the first stream on creating policy certainty to drive the growth of the market, it's very important to integrate gender responsive policies in restoration frameworks. And this means, expanding requirements to integrate gender in decision-making and ensuring women have participation in, land ownership and benefits, and, involve women-led organizations as part of these restoration efforts. And so the G20 Global Land Initiative and UNCCD, we're working primarily with women parliamentarians. We have a workshop every summer in Bonn where we invite parliamentarians from all over the world. And we're seeing that, some of the women parliamentarians are really the ones leading the efforts within their countries. After the training, they'll go back to their countries and they'll introduce bills related to restoration. And so we're really seeing that, among the parliamentarians, a lot of the strongest voices for restoration are the women parliamentarians from that workshop. And so, we're having another one next summer. And so we hope that the participants here will be able to nominate your MPs to the workshop. And in the second area about mobilizing private capital, we know that unlocking investments through financial mechanisms such as, carbon markets and tax incentives is crucial. And we need this private capital to support specifically projects that are women-led, and by women-led businesses. And that way we can support women's networks to access these funds and drive their economic empowerment and increase the scale and impact of these restoration projects that they're already doing. And so from our side, we have this Young Entrepreneurs Program. It's a one-year training program where we provide mentorships, and we have an accelerator where we get these young startups to become investment ready. And so, we have so many talented young women in that cohort. We are training 200 this year. And so, we've seen young women who have businesses that support, shareholder or smallholder farmers, including, using the Internet of Things and machine learning in their apps so that it is able to analyze the crops and the health and the productivity of the soil. And so, that's just one example. But we provide these young entrepreneurs with, access to pitch competitions so that they can get investments from angel investors. And the winner of this program also gets seed funding for their startup. And so that's just one example on how we're trying to contribute to this. And the third, on professionalizing the sector, we understand that, in order to scale restoration, we really need to invest in workforce training. The restoration industry needs to grow. And in order to do that, we need that policy certainty. We need to incentivize private capital, but really providing workforce training for women will be so important to ensure that they're part of the restoration industry. And Karen also mentioned how, this includes access to STEM education, because that is really what's going to drive them to join these types of sectors that influence restoration, such as agroforestry, ecosystem monitoring, as well as management skills. So we've developed several capacity building workshops, including on post-mining land restoration, GIS and remote sensing tools, sustainable agriculture, urban land restoration. And one of the trainings we held was specifically focusing on women in small-scale mining. So a lot of these women are in the informal sector, engaging in small-scale mining, which is, contributing to degradation of land. But we want to be able to reskill these women so that they understand that they can make livelihoods in restoration work. And so, we've held trainings on that and worked with governments as well as mining universities. And so it'd be great to have more of these women-specific trainings. And so, we really want to be able to professionalize the sector so that we can leverage the economy of scales and lower the unit costs of restoration. And lastly, in building accountability systems, as Karen also mentioned that we need to track gender-sensitive data and restoration outcomes. And so national strategies should integrate these gender equality metrics, and we should ensure their participation. Recently, we launched a geospatial data platform with hundreds of data layers, including on certain environmental stressors. And you can look up in live time droughts and wildfires that are happening around the world. There are also socioeconomic indicators as part of the data layers, and that includes gender equality as well. And we're helping the Brazil COP30 presidency in developing a mapping tool for their RAISE initiative, which maps certain areas that have potential for investment. And because they're really prioritizing the restoration of degraded agricultural land. And so we're supporting Brazil in this effort. And so these are just some examples on how we're really trying to work with member states, women's groups, as well as other CSOs, academia, private sector. We're really trying to mobilize a lot of support for land restoration because that's going to be so important. As we see this market grow over time, we're going to see demand increase for restoration work. And so we want to make sure that women are part of that, including in the restoration industry. So thank you so much, Rubina and colleagues for your attention, and I look forward to discussion. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for that wonderful presentation and sort of your discussion, especially to my questions of how you've integrated gender considerations in UNCCD projects and how it's improved restoration outcomes. Before the unfortunate thing is we lost Olivier. I think he had very, very bad internet. So let's just go towards the discussion section now. There's a question from Mr. 𝗀cie𝗰𝗶𝗹 here, and it could be for both Karen and you. So what he's asking is how do project teams, right, handle situations where gender inclusive goals conflict with local social norms or power hierarchies, right? So that's one. And to add to that, he asks, can you share a case where this tension was managed or it wasn't? And were there any outcomes from that? So that's actually a really interesting question. Yeah. Over to you guys.
I'm so sorry, Rita. Could you repeat the two questions? I was
Sorry,
reading the
it's actually one, but what 𝗀cie𝗰𝗋 is asking is how do project teams handle situations where gender inclusive goals, they conflict with local social norms or power hierarchies, right? And he's asking if you have any examples of a case where this tension was managed well, or if it wasn't, and what was the outcome? So yeah, very pertinent question. So anybody would like to take that? Karen, you're on mute.
Okay, well, perhaps I can speak to the first question. Having worked in many different parts of the world at the local level, and my work in the field is mainly in the area of post-disaster recovery and so on. But when you're developing a project, there's a lot of negotiation that happens. And it's very important, I think, to approach that from the beginning and to try to make sure that you have the right stakeholders there, you have the right information, you have women's groups, you're talking to the appropriate government authorities, all of that. And there's a lot of different kind of tactics or approaches that can be used depending on the context. But I'll give you one example. When I was working in Tonga, after there was a major hurricane that had affected one of the islands in Tonga and done massive destruction. So, and of course, a lot of recovery work and land restoration work as well. So I worked with UNDP at the time. And then often what we have, which you would have seen in other parts of the world as well, are disaster recovery projects that involve temporary employment. And so these temporary employment schemes, you can kind of raise money for those fairly quickly, and it has multiple benefits. And so in this case, there had been a massive hurricane. So we were, the temporary employment scheme involved hiring local people to do, first of all, the kind of debris collection and get involved in that process alongside specific engineers who are environmental engineers. So I recall when I was designing the project and having this discussion with the government officials in a country in which it's one of the few countries that at that time had not signed 𝗙cie𝗹𝗹 because they did not believe that women should have the ability to own land. So that was preventing them from being one of the few countries in the world who signed on to the Convention for the Elimination of all Discrimination Against Women. So I was designing this project and I said, okay, it's for temporary employment and we can raise money for this quickly, but one of my conditions is that we have to have equal numbers of men and women benefiting from the project. And not only equal numbers, but they have to have the same rate of pay. Otherwise, it's not fair. So the government official, just kind of was at a loss for words. And then after a few seconds, he said to me, so you want women to work? And I said, yes, I need women to work. And I said, and it's not just me, but it's, the local community said that the women are keen to work, and our funder at the time, the head of UNDP was a woman for the only time in the history of UNDP, Helen Clark from New Zealand. I said, Helen Clark wants us to, I'm not the one, in this context, which was fairly conservative and very aware of hierarchy and authority. I said, it's not my authority as a young woman at that time to tell the minister that this is my decision. I said, but Helen Clark, has decided that. And so, I can't argue with her. So you just kind of try whatever tactics work in that situation. And as part of the negotiation, what we did negotiate in that context was that, okay, that women can be equally involved, because otherwise I said, I'm sorry, but we're going to lose the funding. We won't be able to obtain that funding, which the community desperately needs in the island of 𝗙cie to rebuild and have some temporary income. But so then he said, well, okay, but then the women can't do the same type of work that the men are doing, or they can't, move heavy like materials, and they can't work together with the men. So we came up with this idea that, okay, so then maybe women will be doing different types of work, but it has to be equal numbers of women and they have to be paid the same rate of pay. So then they consulted with the community, and interestingly, they came up with this idea that women would be very good as supervisors of the work crews of people who were kind of gathering up the debris. And so people felt comfortable with that. So we went with that idea. But it also, in a way, this wasn't really discussed with the minister because it wasn't, I don't think it wouldn't have been persuasive to him. But once you have women earning temporary income and men earning temporary income, and then they can each have a say over how that money is spent. And so we were tracking also that women would tend to spend, I think Joanne had referred to this also in her presentation, that when women earn income, they tend to spend it on other items. So it was spent on school supplies for the children, transportation for the children to get to school, restoring household items, food for the household, and things like that. So then we were gathering also an evidence base of, are there differences in the way that men and women spend the money that they earn in these temporary employment programs? And so that was quite an interesting experience. But I guess the bottom line is that you have to be familiar with the context and figure out how to negotiate. And it really needs to be done from the beginning. And also when you're designing the project and setting it up and deciding what the goals will be. And of course, all of you are experts in the particular context that you're working in to know what would work. One thing that I found is to refer to, historical influential figures from that community or particular practices from that community, which show that, that gender norms change over time anyway, and that you also have examples of amazing women who have been leaders. And I'll just mention one in the case of Tonga, which is quite a conservative, socially conservative country, but yet they had, and it's a monarchy, I think the only monarchy in the Pacific, but they had a historical figure who was a Queen 𝗀cie𝗹𝗹, from several decades ago, who was very famous, actually, even internationally for such a small country, because she was such an example of a dignified leader and one that used the country's resources widely. She had a lot of investment into the education system for everyone and was a very wise leader. And so no one could argue that she was quite outstanding. And so then I think that also showed that women, you know, that even from their own history and from their own society, you can see that women can do anything. Women have leadership abilities that can even be seen on the world stage. And so this also is a way of them kind of considering their own culture and what the norms and values are in their own culture.
Yeah, no, I think Karen's stories were great and really highlighted different ways that you can integrate gender considerations, even despite different social norms. And so, I mean, one way that we're trying to tackle this is by working with faith groups. And so, we've held different workshops to really build the capacity of faith groups and get the support of faith leaders for restoration. And we're hoping that, when they see how restoration leads to not only environmental outcomes, but, greater social outcomes, it really alleviates people from poverty. It also, contributes to a lot of social development and economic development too, that they'll be more supportive. And so we're seeing that actually faith groups are doing a lot in restoration. There's so many faith organizations that are leading restoration efforts. And we've done a stock take to outline a lot of these projects. And we're seeing that they actually do involve women a lot of times too. And so, we don't necessarily see that it's exclusive all the time, but that women as part of the communities, as part of the faith communities, that they're still being involved in restoration work around the world. And so, but we're hoping that, through these efforts that when local communities see how faith groups can also lead in these environmental outcomes, that they can also become more involved. So yeah, that's just one example on how we're trying to, break barriers in that regard, and by working with all different types of stakeholders.
Thank you so much, both Karen and Joanne. I think Ujjwal is also saying that, they've also had great results leveraging faith-based approaches, and they're huge catalysts, right? So both your, I think, examples are very, very interesting, and especially when you're dealing with, very, very stringent social norms, and it's a lot of traditional practices, a lot of social norms that sort of govern communities, right? And to be able to challenge that, it does take time, and it's interesting, at least your experiences. It's interesting to listen to it as well. It's very fun. So I did have one question for Joanne, actually, because you were saying that in your at least session that there's an opportunity for at least 169%. Is that the right number that I'm using? Percent growth for the restoration market. Is that correct?
Well, that was specifically from the Brazil market. We're seeing that, restoration projects have the potential to have the return on investment be 169%.
Okay.
And so, that's a high ROI for
High, right? But
yeah. So we're hoping investors become more interested in restoration work when they see these economic gains that can be had.
But can you, like, for our participants, elaborate a little more on what these economic gains actually look like? Like, how do you connect the dots between economic gains and how they have an impact on, on livelihoods, and of course also on their social lives, right? Or on lifestyle changes. So are there examples that you have? Can you also help us connect the dots of what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, land really is a nexus to a lot of the different global goals that we have, right? Because if you improve soil health and productivity, then your agricultural output will be a lot more, right? And so that means more food security for people in that community. That means that, they have more produce to sell on the market. And if a country is also increasing their agricultural outputs, then they can also export those to other countries too, right? So this leads to, higher economic growth within that country. And so, that's just one example. Land restoration also leads to, since land stores a lot of carbon. And so, this can also help with climate goals as well, in helping countries to achieve their climate goals, reduce global warming around the world. And, if you also invest in land restoration, certain economic activities that lead to degradation, such as mining, if you invest in restoration of that land, then you can also return that land into a productive area that can be turned into farms or forests, things that can contribute to further economic activity after the degradation and the restoration happens. And so, there's so many different benefits that come from land restoration. And so, those are just some of them. So basically, it's by investing in land, you're really investing in, food security and poverty alleviation, gender equality, and addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. So it's just such a multiplier that it makes sense to invest in land restoration.
It's fascinating, isn't it? For the longest time, we've had like a conversation about like a lot of neoliberal policies and a lot of sort of capital-based, like how do you market economies, right? But the shift slowly, gradually towards a restoration economy is fascinating, and it gives a very positive outlook to the future, of course, right? And it also sort of helped me sort of identify how Karen was talking about, shared with us the example from Iran, right? Where the area of where a desertified area sort of was restored to more arable land. So that's really, really fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing those examples. So I'm just hoping if we have any more questions from our participants. If not, then I would like to move on to the closing remarks by Mrinalini Rai, our director and founder from Women for Biodiversity, and hopefully she'll be also able to shed some light on, how the United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity has also sort of, utilized or how they've developed the gender policy and how they've implemented it in their own work. So I'd like to invite Mrinalini. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rubina. Thank you, the distinguished panelists, Karen and Joanne. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so as an introduction, hi to everybody from Geneva, where I am attending the Minamata COP6. And I want to share this in the reference because I see that in the question chat, somebody had also asked about the in regards to mining. So first, let me, because Olivier is not here, so let me just quickly also take that opportunity. First is that the reason for also having this webinar was to look at these linkages. We've always talking about working in silos and how there are different work that are in some ways culminating all together, right? You have the commitments on restoration, not only in the UNCCD work, but also in the Climate Paris Agreement. You also have a commitment on restoration, and in particular also in the CBD's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted in 2022 in December. So I think a core element we also wanted to, Women for Biodiversity wanted to also have this discussion is because also with the understanding that you have conservation efforts, which are really very important and do contribute to the global commitments that parties to various conventions are making, but also understanding that in the CBD, the KMGBF, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there are also other relevant targets, in particular to Target 2. You have Target 8 and Target 11. Directly on Target 2, which is also a 30 by 30, but it talks about restoring 30% of lands and waters by 2030. Then you have Target 8, as I think some of the panels also talked about on the climate, right? So there is this link with that target on climate change with regard to ecosystem-based approaches, and of course with nature-based solutions, and also Target 11, which talks about connectivity, saying that we have a lot of fragmented spaces, and then one way of looking at this connectivity is an important way to also contribute to the so-called biodiversity outcomes. Now looking at where we are really on the gender, the Sorry, my phone was, somebody was ringing. So also understand, like Karen and John also talked about the challenges, but I also want to really look at is that there are these opportunities to also complement each other. And both Karen and both John also talked about the different initiatives that are being taken place, right? You have the UNCCD has a land ambassador. G20 has also been looking at community-led restoration efforts and also been giving funding. And then also to complement that work, you also have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is hosted between the work of the UNEP and FAO. And a big agenda of that work is also to really ensure that the restoration efforts also are amplified and also contribute to all these, either you're talking about the LDN, you're talking about the 𝗀𝗋𝗄, you're talking about the Paris Agreement, that this is the decade. So the decade also is until 2030. So a lot of parallel things happening. And we just wanted to also see that, okay, there are all these parallel things happening, which are really very important. But one thing definitely that we really need to make sure that all these processes, initiatives, policies, and plans do really ensure that there is this gender dimension into that, right? Because considering that women are, and there are a lot of research on how women's contribution, our panelists have really shared about fantastic examples that they are contributing a lot, but usually sometimes, or actually most of the time, their work is seen as voluntary. So where do we really stand in when we're talking about that, we need to have access to capacity building, access to technologies, access to funding, ensuring that those technical aspects also really make a space for us to ensure that women's organizations, women are also part of that, not just as voluntary contributions, right? Like saying, okay, and that has been a historic role. And I think one of the participants, Ujjwal, talked about the social and cultural aspect, right? And within that, what happens is that you look at, okay, that those are what women do. They are the caregivers. They do intergeneration transfer of knowledge, and it's their contribution. But also understanding that, like I'll go back to Joanne's comment by saying that for rights to also be ensured and to advance women's empowerment, one key element that we keep forgetting about is livelihoods, right? We're talking about economic incentives, but not only incentives, but economic right. We're saying that women also have a right to their development. And that also comes up from saying that how do we really integrate that? Now, building upon the comment that one of the people had about mining, and also for looking at both that Joanne and that Karen is also here, is that we have data missing. Yes, we do have a data missing on how women are engaged in restoration or also how they're looking in conservation. But I'm here in Geneva where the Minamata COP6 is taking place. It is a convention that talks about mercury pollution. And one of the agenda items, the standing agenda item, or one of the core agendas of the Minamata on mercury agenda is on ASGM, artisanal and small scale mining. And I think, John, you talked about it. And there is data out there. So we are here also discussing that, you cannot look at mining as separate because there are also commitments, right? So you have mining for economic incentives. We're talking about just transition for climate. But at the same time, you also have other international commitments that are asking for restoration and conservation. So how do you really balance that very thin line, right? And because all these minings, for either it is economic, political, or you're talking about for this just transition, do have not only impact on biodiversity loss, absolutely very gravely, but also on peoples. Are they talking about indigenous peoples, local communities, people in vulnerable situation, and majority of them are women and children. An example of ASGM I'll give you is there is data, and we have been discussing it in this forum, that according to data, there are about 15 million artisanal workers globally. And within that, there are approximately 5 million. Data show that there are 5 million women and children who are either working in those sectors. And how do we really then push for this agenda to build these cooperation and synergies? So, of course, you really need to also really make sure that you do awareness raising, right? Awareness raising in the community, the health benefits are really very important. But you see, it will not go anywhere if it is not matched by national laws and policies. First, the recognition at the global agenda saying that, okay, this is an issue. ASGM contributes to biodiversity loss, but also, Karen, you talked about that. What is LDN? The land degradation neutrality also means to prevent land from getting desertified, right? And mining is one of them, right? The ASGM. So I think there are these links that we can build in, but also saying that we don't only need policy at the international level, but we also need changes of national governments to take some responsibility. And this also comes up with not only national legislations, but also funding. Capacity building is very important. Awareness raising is very important. But if you don't also have dedicated funding to support communities and community-led initiatives for them to take out what's really very important for them, then once again, everything's going to be half-baked. We are almost there. There is a larger recognition of the roles of women. There's also link up with the rights of, like all these processes should not impact rights of peoples, right? So I think that becomes really very important. And restoration. So it's that there is a lot of commitments, not only including an area, but it's not only about areas. So we're always talking about in restoration and the support for community-led restoration by saying that, look, it's not about maybe, 50,000 hectares of only an area commitment within the work, but these are also fragmented indigenous peoples, local communities, fisher folks in the coastal communities. So how do we really also make sure that those case studies, those examples also get adequately recognized, but also funded? And of course, within that, as we have been sharing in this webinar, is saying that women really make a big portion of those communities and societies. So with that, Rubina, I'll give back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that. I think those were really, great remarks, closing remarks for us, and just sort of tying up everything that Karen and sort of Joanne shared with us, right? It's very, very important to understand that women are they should be at the heart of restoration, that gender equality and gender integration cannot just be done through the sidelines, right? It has to be very, very intentional. And it's really, really great to see that UNCCD is doing it very, very intentionally as well, with solid examples from the ground, amazing examples, with Joanne sort of shining a light on how restoration economics and restoration market will slowly, hopefully, fingers crossed, will be able to, sort of, take over the kind of neoliberal capitalist markets that we have right now. It does give us a positive sort of ray of light. And of course, with Tina sort of highlighting that policies cannot just be, sort of advocated at a international level, but they need to be, but we need to hold our governments accountable as well. And through that, we can also sort of hold other actors who have these interests, in basically economic interests. We can hold them accountable as well. There is a shift towards more sort of a shift towards a moral code where we need to look after our sort of environment, our biodiversity, through conservation and restoration. So it's really, really great that we are able to highlight this with our work. With that, I understand that we are also coming to an end. So before we do that, Sumina, do you want to sort of take over and request? I think all of us. Should I do that for you? I think all of us to turn on our cameras and let's take a picture, right?
I would also like to request all the speakers first. Sorry, I'm just going to. Okay, the speakers, if you could look into the camera and give me a smile, please. Thank you. Just one more. Thank you. And now with everybody, just a second. Please bear with me.
Please take your time. That's okay.
Oh, lovely. Thanks, everybody. Wait, 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. Just one more. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samina. Once again, thank you so much for being, thank you so much, Karen and Joanne, for taking time out from your busy schedule and, sharing with us all of the information, all of the findings from your own work. It has been absolutely wonderful to have you. Today's presentation was so fun. It was so interesting for me as well. And yeah, Tina, thank you so much for your closing remarks. I understand that you're also very busy. You're at a convention in Geneva, and good luck also. And for all of our participants, thank you for being such great sports, for asking questions. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll be able to gather again soon. Have a lovely day, afternoon.
Thank you, Ravina.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for
Thank
having
you,
us.
everybody.